Chapter 24, Nostalgia. Max Tennyson shook his head at the two tiny figures in front of him. One of them was familiar, the other not so. The short girl glaring up at him with green eyes almost too big for her face was clearly his granddaughter, as she had been 5 years ago at age 11. She'd often glared at him like that during her second year wearing the Omnitrix, up until she lost feedback. She had gotten slightly cocky during that year, though all that confidence had been lost with the loss of that transformation.
"This isn't funny,"
she squeaked as Cooper let out a muffled laugh. Pierce had buried his head in his arms, laughing loudly as the plumbers around them managed to subdue chuckles. Rook, small like her, but still a few inches taller, nodded next to her. He seemed to keep a bit behind her, though, as if he was a bit scared of what was happening. Max nodded. "No, it's really not. I've dealt with a 10-year-old Omnitrix wielder before, and it's not always fun." She pouted at him.
"First, I'm 11. Second, I wasn't that bad."
Max frowned. Don't you mean aren't that bad?" She shook her head, waving her hand. The Omnitrix had shrunken with her, but remained the one Asmith had given her not too long ago.
"Not time travel this time. Still 16, up here."
She tapped the side of her head.
"Just not physically. You can blame Billy Billions for this, by the way."
Max nodded and held out his hand. "Come on. Let's get you down to the lab, find out what's going on." Jen nodded, grabbed Rook by the hand, and took off towards the lab, Max quick to follow. He huffed. "Oh, I'm getting too old for this." Cooper held back a laugh at that, too, as he followed the Magister and the two children. Jen frowned at the door. Max and a few other plumbers were going to see if they could get the de-aging gun from Billy, claiming the two now young teens would be safer staying behind. She turned to Rook.
"You coming?"
He frowned.
How do you intend to leave? The door is locked, and I do not have my badge, nor will it respond to vocal commands from either of us."
Jen grinned and selected Goop on the Omnitrix. It was weird seeing her aliens she hadn't had when she was younger. They, too, were now more children than adolescents. But melting through the door was as easy as it always was. She and Rook took off for Billion's tower. The fight there, with both Billy and the Dimension 12 robots, ended with Rook and Jen finally getting their hands on the de-aging gun.
"You ready to say goodbye to that tail?"
Jen teased, and Rook smiled.
"I do not know. I have just grown used to it again."
His tail smacked him in the face, and he frowned.
"I am over it."
Jen doubled over with laughter. When she finally collected herself, she fiddled with the settings on the gun and aimed it, blasting Rook back to his regular age. She tossed him the gun, and he shot her with it, too, returning her to her proper age as well. She ran hands through her short hair and smiled. They collected Billy Billions and went to meet with the plumbers gathering outside.
"I am quite curious as to why you decided to cut your hair short. It seems that Earth fashion is quite varied, unlike the more traditional fashion of Ravana, but I see few females with hair as short as yours."
She nodded. "It's more practicality than fashion. I got dragged around by my hair a few too many times back when I first got the Omnitrix. It became a problem in fights, so I got it cut off. Much more low maintenance and can't be used against me this way." Rook nodded.
"That is very practical."
They were accosted by plumbers and press when they got outside, so it took a bit for Jen to corner Cooper. She had an idea that maybe they could help Billy Billions get back to his proper age, but she'd need help getting it to work. Chapter 25, Homeward. Rook was excited. He hadn't been home in years. He wished Jen could have come with him, but an emergency on a nearby plumber station demanded her attention, and she'd had to skip the visit to Ravana. His father was still as disapproving as ever of his choice of career, and his brother lamented the fact that Jen hadn't come with him. But things on Ravana weren't quite the way he remembered them. For one thing, the Muroids were getting downright clever. For another, Rayona, his one-time fiancé, and his sister Rook were not on planet. He had been beyond shocked when he learned this from his little brother.
What do you mean they are not on planet, young one?
He asked as he worked in the field. Young one shook his head.
They went to the plumber base to ask for assistance against the Muroids.
Young one said, bouncing slightly. After a disapproving look from their father, he quieted but kept talking in a softer voice.
Shar believes there may be another intelligence behind the Muroids. Rayona did not wish for Shar to go alone. The two of them have grown quite close since you departed.
He edged a bit closer to his brother.
On the subject of closeness, have you found what you went out seeking?
Rook felt the fur on his face puff up slightly. His little brother knew nothing of a Mars. That was a story for adults, those who had lost their Bienthak, and his still had not fallen off. But he was clever, as anyone Rook Blonko knew. He knew that at least part of the reason Blonko had left Ravana was due to breaking off his engagement to Rayona. Still, the words the universe had spoken to him in the cavern were cryptic. He wasn't sure he knew what they meant, but more and more lately, he had found himself looking at his partner with something other than friendship in his heart. More than once since arriving on Ravana, he had turned to share a look or word with her, only to find her not there. It was odd being without her.
I do not know. Perhaps,
he said as he continued to aid in the harvest. Young one raised an eyebrow.
Do you even know what it is you were looking for?
Blonko frowned as a quick flash of green eyes and brown hair and laughter echoed through his mind.
Does anyone know what they are looking for in life, young one?
He asked, and young one frowned.
You are beginning to sound like Mother,
he pointed out, and Blonko laughed. Jen couldn't help but see the irony. There was quite a bit of it going around, really. She had left Earth with Rook, at Grandpa Max's insistence. He said she needed a break after finding out that one of her most dangerous enemies was still alive. She had disagreed. She wanted to hunt malware down for what he had done to feedback. But part of her, a small and treacherous part, wanted someone else to find the mechamorph. She wanted someone else to deal with this problem. Because if what happened to feedback happened again, she would be unable to run from it as she had when she was 11. She hadn't told anyone the real reason she had Asmith take the Omnitrix off her the first time. She knew Grandpa Max had guessed, maybe Gwen had too, but she'd never outright stated it. But that wasn't what was ironic. No, what was ironic was that she had set out to have something of a vacation, as much as alien farm work could be considered relaxing, and found herself in the middle of a plot. Why did this always happen to her? She'd insisted that she would be able to handle it when they got the emergency signal. Rook had dropped her at the base in the system and gone home. But waiting for her were two female Ravanaganders. Rayona was beautiful and suspicious of everyone, but Rook her partner's sister, she was amused to learn, was fiery and held the same kind of curiosity that her brother had. It had to run in the family, but Jen kept that tidbit to herself. According to the two, the Muroids, rodents native to Ravana, were acting strangely, hoarding amber ogia where they would normally eat it on the spot, developing the ability to walk on their hind legs, and fighting more fiercely than they ever had before. Jen sat forward in her chair. Okay, I'll help. Give me 10 minutes to get a skiff. The two female Ravanaganders frowned. Ship. My partner took his. Actually, you know him. she said, nodding to Rookshar. She brightened.
My brother is your partner.
Jen nodded. Yep. Rayona nodded.
Then you are Gen 10. He has spoken of you often in his correspondence.
Jen turned away to the door as she blushed slightly. Why did that make her blush? She talked about her partner to her friends and family all the time. Rookshar stepped up next to her.
He speaks very highly of you,
Rookshar said, and Jen smiled wide. It was good to know that her partner trusted her.
Is he here?
She shook her head. No, he headed down to the Harvest Festival. Wait here for a minute. I need to get that skiff. They nodded. Of course, it didn't go as well as she wanted it to. They arrived under the radar, an easy task, since Ravana didn't have a radar, save for the small, on-planet Plumber base, who knew they were coming. Or at least, it wasn't supposed to have a radar. Jen changed form when they landed to try and blend in, sort of a moot point since her Ravanaгаnder form, a recent discovery that she was pretty sure she'd gotten when Rook had temporarily fused with Upchuck, had green eyes, wore a suit of prototech armor, like Rook's, and had fur of a tint closer to green than blue. As the goal here was stealth, so as not to alert the being behind the Muroid's sudden odd behavior, this was not ideal. But she pushed on into the cave Rookshar had tracked the Muroids to before going to the Plumbers. She insisted that Rayona and Rookshar stay behind, as they didn't have training or plumber tech. Rook Blonko had grown curious. Curious enough to take a leaf out of Jen's book and investigate himself, despite the fact that he was supposed to be on vacation. He had never been one to sit to the side, after all. He tracked a stray Muroid back to the cavern. Sneaking inside was easy since the leader of the pack of more advanced Muroids was occupied at the moment. Rook blinked at the sight before him. Hanging in a very complex-looking device was a female Ravanaгаnder, one Rook had never seen before. It was worrying that the intelligence behind the Muroids was now taking hostages. Then he really looked at the Ravanaгаnder. Her fur was closer to green than the natural blue tint. She was wearing armor, his armor by the looks of it, or at least the same model. And as she glared down at the figure he recognized as Fistrick, he spotted that where there should have been amber or gold, this Ravanagander's eyes were emerald green.
Oh, bralada,
he swore under his breath, pulling his proto-tool off his shoulder and switching it to the short blade with a practiced motion. That wasn't a Ravanaгаnder, it was Jen. But as Fistrick boasted and bragged, her ear twitched, and she glanced in his direction. For a moment, those startling emerald eyes met his, and she shook her head a fraction of an inch. There was more happening here than her captivity. He focused on the words Fistrick was speaking. He would be stealing all of the Amber Ogia, using the Muroids to do it. Inside harvesting mechs he'd taught them to drive. He had to warn his people. There would be open warfare on Ravana if this was allowed to continue. She glanced up at him again as Fistrick turned away from her and jerked her head back down the cavern he had come from. She wanted him to go, to choose his people over her. She would find a way out of this on her own. He nodded slightly and turned back the way he had come, catching the small smile on her face as he did. He raced back the way he'd come and was almost completely out of the cavern when he realized that he was smiling. He blinked for an instant, searching his feelings. There was a warmth in his chest at the knowledge that she would not make him choose between her and his people. It was an unfamiliar but pleasant feeling, but for now he filed it away. There were larger problems to deal with than his feelings for his partner.